In August of 1992, a little game called Mortal Kombat hit arcades and turned the one-on-one fighter genre on its decapitated ear by replacing hand-drawn sprites with ones digitized from real-life actors. Oh, and it was pretty violent too, and that violence was clearly enhanced by the digitized graphics, with the game now appearing more lifelike than anything that had come before it. Midway wasn't the only company that was experimenting with using digitized graphics in their games though, and just a month later, Konami would follow suit with Lethal Enforcers, a game that featured far more killing than Mortal Kombat, but managed to leave the victim's spines intact. Lethal Enforcers, however, wasn't a fighting game. It was instead a light gun game that was clearly inspired by the gritty inner-city action movies and TV shows of the 70s and 80s, and it came complete with light guns called Justifiers that were very reminiscent of the Smith & Wesson Model 29 44 Magnum carried by Dirty Harry. Lethal Enforcers proved to be very popular in the arcades, and Konami banked on that popularity, releasing 16-bit home versions of the game for the Genesis, Sega CD, and Super Nintendo. Previously on the channel, I covered those Genesis and Sega CD versions in episodes 52 and 152, respectively, if you're interested in knowing more about how Konami handled those ports of that game. But this isn't a review of Lethal Enforcers, or Mortal Kombat for that matter. It's a review of the Genesis port of Lethal Enforcers 2, Konami's attempt to follow up on the popularity of that original game. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are confused because I've spent the first half of the intro talking about games that aren't the subject of this actual video. Well, hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where you learn that sometimes you have to just let me talk for a bit. It'll make sense, eventually. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. But not this week. Okay, where were we? Oh yes, the game that we were actually reviewing this week, Lethal Enforcers 2. Well, after Lethal Enforcers proved to be a massive hit in not just the arcades, but also on home consoles, Konami had no choice but to follow it up with a sequel, and in spring of 1994, Lethal Enforcers 2 Gunfighters made its way to the arcades and was shortly thereafter followed up with ports to the Genesis and Sega CD, but no Super Nintendo version this time around. It's unclear if Konami simply didn't want to deal with censorship headaches with a Nintendo version, or if it was because the first Lethal Enforcers simply wasn't very good on the Super Nintendo. For the game's subtitle, you can probably assume that we're no longer in Kansas anymore. Or actually, that's probably a bad phrase to use there because this game may very well take place in Kansas. Anyway, to keep things fresh and in no way rip off Mad Dog McCree, Konami decided to take players to the Old West this time around, giving the game a whole new setting while still keeping the shoot first, ask questions later mentality that the first game had. Did it work? And how did the arcade port handle being crammed into the 16-bit hardware of the Genesis? Well, I'll try to answer both of those questions and more, but first, a look at the package. If you're familiar with Lethal Enforcers at all, or happen to see either of my reviews for that game, when you see this package, you might feel a bit underwhelmed. But for those of you that aren't aware, here's what the original game looks like, and you can immediately see the difference, with Lethal Enforcers 2 being held in just the standard clamshell, and then this giant packaging for the original game. The reason for that is because Lethal Enforcers came with a home version of the Justifier light gun, as the game is not compatible with Sega's own Genesis light gun, the Menacer. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but I assume it's due to how Lethal Enforcers handles two players, with the guns daisy-chaining through each other to get back to the console. For Lethal Enforcers 2, Konami chose not to force players to buy another Justifier if they were already an owner of the original game, and instead released it on its own. Well, for the Genesis version anyway. Technically, for the Japanese Mega CD, the game was released in both Justifier and Sans Justifier versions, But we're talking about the Genesis version today, and for whatever reason, neither Lethal Enforcers nor Lethal Enforcers 2 were released for the Mega Drive in Japan. As far as my copy here is concerned, it's in decent shape, but there's definitely better out there. The hang tab has been removed from the top, and there's some light scratching to the outer cover in places. The color looks good on the inner cover with no water or sun damage, but unfortunately the bottom has some edge wear from where it slipped out over the years. I could probably replace this with a better one relatively cheaply, as complete copies currently only go for between $20 and $25, but the edge wear isn't that bad, and I just don't care enough to look for a better one. Before I even get to the artwork, there's one thing that has to get mentioned on the front cover, and that's the VRC rating. The original Lethal Enforcers was notable for being one of the first and only games to receive a MA-17 rating. Granted, that's due to the VRC being short-lived, as it was replaced by the ESRB after only about a year and a half. But the point remains that it was placed in a category that was only applied to a few other titles. However, if you notice, Lethal Enforcers 2 is not MA-17 rated and instead has been downgraded to the more common MA-13. Why? Well, you've got me there. I don't know, really. About the only thing I can think of is that the MA-17 wasn't granted due to content necessarily, but for including the somewhat lifelike Justifier controller. Also, it should be noted that this was only a VRC issue, as both the games had a BBFC PG rating in Europe. As far as the cover art goes, I like it. It's slightly cartoony, but I think it gets across the feel of the game. Europe used the same art, so there's not really a question of who did it better this time around, but that will be something to discuss when I review the Sega CD version, as, unsurprisingly, Japan did things slightly different for that release. Flipping over the back, and we've got not 3, not 4, but 5 screenshots, one for each level of the game, and some actually insightful flavor text on the back that mentions 2 of the main differences between this game and the previous one, which is nice to see, as oftentimes this text is reserved for much less meaningful hype. I'll cover that more in the actual review, as they are important distinctions that keep the game from just being Lethal Enforcers again with a coat of 1800s paint. Quickly opening up the package, and the manual is somewhat disappointing. Granted, the game is a light gun shooter, and there's really not much to discuss here from a complexity standpoint, but this would have been the perfect time to give the game a backstory, maybe discuss who the protagonists are and why they're going off to the various different locations, and perhaps who the bosses are that you'll be facing off against. But no, this is really just a bare-bones manual that tells you just enough to get up and running, and not much else. For shame, Konami. Okay, well, that's the package. Let's heat up those trigger fingers and blast some varmints. I mentioned in the previous section that Lethal Enforcers 2 shouldn't be considered just Lethal Enforcers reskinned with a Wild West motif. And you might be wondering what I meant by that. If you're pressed for time and you really just wanted to briefly describe Lethal Enforcers 2, it's not exactly an inaccurate statement to describe it as such. And anyone who quickly looked at the game could be forgiven for thinking that, and then just moving on to the next game. The Justifiers are the same, there's the same 5-level structure, the graphics are based around digitized video, players start out with several units of health that can be lost either by letting yourself be hit by an enemy or accidentally shooting an innocent bystander. There's the occasional bonus level, and at the end of a level, players receive a ranking based on how well they did. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot that's the same here. And honestly, if you didn't care for the original Lethal Enforcers, I don't think a change of scenery for the sequel is going to make a believer out of you. But even though it's clear that Konami was trying to go back to the same arcade light gun well with Lethal Enforcers 2, I don't think it's really fair to the developers to write it off just like that. And there are a few changes, so let's give the game a proper run through. Besides, I've put far more effort into reviewing far worse games on the channel. Anyone who saw the previous episode 250 Spectacular knows that. Let's go ahead and discuss these differences between the games. On the back of the box, the packaging states, "Throw out the accuracy scores, the goal here is to survive." If you're not familiar with the original Lethal Enforcers, that might not mean much to you other than just being advertising speak to hype up players, and it does work in that regard as well. However, what this really means is that one of the more annoying aspects of Lethal Enforcers is gone. You see, in the first game, your player would achieve a rank depending on how accurate you were with your shots, but for every innocent bystander you hit, you would lose a rank. The ranks were important because you had to be at a certain rank to progress to the next level. So you could theoretically get through a level with a pretty good run, but accidentally get a bit too trigger happy and then have to replay the entire level because you accidentally killed too many innocents. I don't remember how many times I replayed the Chinatown level in that game because of that, but it was a lot. Now, in Lethal Enforcers 2, that level progression requirement is thrown out. As it just states in the ad copy, you are definitely just trying to survive because the game is more difficult. You still don't want to hit innocents because even if you're a complete psychopath, you'll take precious damage as a result. This wasn't just done on a whim, however. It's because of the second change that was made. In that same paragraph on the back of the box, it states, if you hit an opponent with a grazing shot, you'll have to shoot again quick to put them out of commission before they retaliate. Essentially, what this means is that unlike the first game, where most of the enemies were taken out with one shot, in Lethal Enforcers 2, you're going to want to get in the habit of double tapping enemies unless you're using a special weapon. There's plenty that will go down with just one shot, especially the ones on horseback or on the covered wagons in the second level, but it's just smart to make absolutely sure that they're dead if possible, because all it takes is a few bad guys getting a dying shot off to really ruin your run through a level. This change in gameplay means that you probably aren't going to be getting the best accuracy ranks at the end of levels, and not to mention, with that increase in difficulty, it would make it far too hard to make it through the game with limited continues if you had to redo a level. Although that's more of a problem for the home version rather than the arcade. Aside from those differences, and of course the change from a modern to a Wild West theme, the games are expectedly pretty similar. Each of the 5 levels are made up of subsections that are either static shooting galleries or scrolling scenes from the left to the right, with the goal of getting to a boss at the end of each level that, with one notable exception, has an extended life bar. To get there and vanquish your foes along the way, you're armed with a 6-shot revolver by default, but can collect special weapons as you go that will stay with you temporarily until they either run out of ammo, or if it's one you can reload, until you're hit by an enemy. This time around, some of these special weapons are replaced with ones that are more era-specific. For instance, the automatic is swapped out for dual-wielding revolvers, the Magnum is replaced with a 50 cal, the assault rifle is now just a rifle, the machine gun has been turned into a Gatling gun, and finally, in the craziest change, the grenade launcher is now a freaking cannon. Yes, you can now potentially launch cannonballs at the ne'er-do-wells. I think I would have liked to have seen the power-ups pop up a few more times during the levels, but I definitely can't complain about the ones that they chose. They did a perfect job of tailoring the weapons to the Wild West. If you've seen the arcade version of Lethal Enforcers, and then the Genesis version of that game, you know that the Genesis version had to have some sacrifices made to get the game on the console. And this was of course due to the arcade version running on more advanced hardware, dubbed the, and I'm sure I'm going to pronounce this wrong, the ZexX platform. For Lethal Enforcers 2, the arcade version stepped forward even more, as it was one of the first games to use Konami's brand new for 1994 GX arcade platform instead of the ZexX, while the Genesis hardware, with its already limited on-screen color palette, just got 2 years older. The result is a game that looks, well, rough in places. For digitized graphics to look good, 2 things are needed: a large color palette and plenty of space to store those colorful graphics. As you're probably aware, the Genesis is already at a deficit when it comes to on-screen colors, with it only being able to display 64 colors at a time out of a total of 512 by default. This leads to some fairly odd-looking scenes, such as the green horses in the second level, and the even more yellow than normal desert in the train level. There's also other differences, such as the Genesis version using smaller character sprites on average,
and those character sprites have considerably less frames of animation for both enemies and innocents. Honestly, the lack of animation isn't that big a deal because, oddly enough, the arcade version wasn't very well animated either in a lot of areas, but it does give the game a slightly different feel. The smaller sprites is probably a bigger issue, not just because they don't look as good, and clearly there's detail that's lost, but also just from the simple standpoint that a smaller sprite is going to be more difficult to hit with a light gun as there's less target to hit. Assuming you're actually playing it on a CRT and not emulating it, that is. Wink, wink. You'd think that Konami might try to counter this by providing more space to the game's ROM to allow for some higher detailed textures, larger characters, and more frames of animation to better match up with the arcade version. But unfortunately, the game uses the same 16 megabit cartridge size that was used for the original Lethal Enforcers. 16 megabits is nothing to sneeze at for a cartridge on the 4th generation console, but with the Genesis needing all the help it could get here, this seems like a bit of a miss on Konami's part, especially with Lethal Enforcers 2 releasing almost a year and a half later. My guess, and this is just a guess mind you, is that Konami was a bit lazy here and simply reused the same game engine, just swapping graphics and sound files in, and because of whatever limitations that previous code had, it wouldn't really be able to handle the improvements even if there was enough space for them. To be fair to Konami, I get not wanting to throw extra R&D at a title on an aging console that would soon be replaced by the 32-bit era, but the bottom line here is that there's times when Lethal Enforcers 2 is hard to look at, and an anachronism at a time when games were getting more colorful, not less. From an audio perspective, with the Genesis utilizing FM-based audio, having a cartridge with enough ROM space for samples is important as well. But even without any extra space, it appears that this version holds up a bit better than in the graphical realm. While the game's music isn't as nice as the arcade's nearly orchestral soundtrack, it's pretty good in its own right and manages to still have that western twang to it, while revving things up a notch for the intense boss fights. I don't think I've heard a bad soundtrack from Konami on the Genesis, and Lethal Enforcers 2 is no different. However, what's even more important than the background music is the sound effects. Oftentimes, both enemies and innocents will have audio cues associated with when they pop up on the screen, which can be crucial for knowing quickly who and where to shoot. And these samples sound great. Could they be a bit clearer? Sure, but I've heard far worse speech on the console, and my only real complaint is that they sound a bit repetitive after a while. But that's really scraping the bottom of the barrel when it comes to issues. Once I figured out how to get the emulator set up correctly to play Lethal Enforcers 2, and yes, I do emulate light guns specifically for the reviews, go ahead and do your complaining now, I had a lot of fun this week blasting enemies like it was 1870. Sure, it's not as pretty as the arcade version, and it doesn't sound quite as good, but this is Lethal Enforcers 2, and if you already had a Justifier from purchasing the first game, this is a great reason to pull it back out. Plus, just like the first game, it supports 2 players, and for some of the more difficult sections, you may want to have that extra firepower. Speaking of that, if I had to make one complaint about the game, it's a tad on the difficult side, and even in easy mode, the bosses have what seem to be a ton of health, making the boss fights more of an endurance test rather than fun. While it doesn't break any new ground, I'm giving Lethal Enforcers 2 3 stars, and believe it or not, I'm looking forward to reviewing this game again in 100 episodes for the Sega CD version.
And that's it for Lethal Enforcers 2 Gunfighters. One thing I didn't mention earlier, and I'm about to ruin the day of a certain set of the population if you weren't already having your skin crawl due to this, take a look at the game's logo. It's more noticeable on the title screen, but see just how off-center the 2 is below the title? I don't know if their graphic designer was just having a bad day or what, but that's pretty rough. You know, if I felt like being petty, that's the kind of thing that I would consider taking a star away from the review score. But I'm going to be nice and overlook it this time. You're on thin ice, Konami. Next time on Zilog and Moto, with the NFL season officially kicking off this week, I think it's time for some football. But not just any football game, oh no. Well, see, we've already covered the debut titles of the legendary series like John Madden Football and Joe Montana Football, but wait, there is another. I've yet to cover any of these companies' sports titles on the channel, which is actually somewhat understandable because a few of them are pretty hard to find these days. But if you know any video games from this company, you probably know this one. Unless you just really happen to be into beach volleyball, that is. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 252. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!